But maybe a better way to proceed would be to have Luke talk a little bit about his impressions of this, like requirements or like what matters to the issuance of honey, because models need to basically help us bring clarity, not just make a bunch of math to make math.
Yeah, maybe I can start with sort of some problem statements and kind of the status quo, and we can use that to sort of inform where we go next.
That sounds.
So right now we've got like issuance rate on a per block basis. It's set at like approximately 60% per year. I say approximate because it compounds every time somebody clicks the button. Essentially, we've got like an issuance rate of 60% per year. And we can set that via governance, so we can like adjust that over time. But our kind of expectation is like early on, we're in sort of a growth bootstrapping phase, and so high issuance doesn't matter too much. But long term, a 60% per year growth rate is probably not sustainable, and gives people lots of like fears about like, oh, if I'm holding honey now, the value is just going to evaporate due to issuance. And if people have that perception now, then things like funding farms or funding pollen is significantly less effective because people don't feel like there's a long-term value in the asset and they don't want to hold it. So on one hand, we need to ensure that our issuance policy allows ongoing distribution of honey. So we need to be able to keep honey flowing perpetually. But we also want to ensure expectations with respect to dilution of honey holders over time. So we want to ensure that we're balancing those things. One approach that I've been kind of pondering is that in order to achieve those goals, we can distribute honey either via issuance or via, the source of the honey that we distribute can either come from issuance or it can come from fee capture via other mechanisms. And so we can say that there's inflows into the common pool from these sources, and we can target a specific value of like the token supply that we want to be flowing over some period. We don't care whether it comes from issuance or fee capture. We would generally, from the perspective of a honey holder, prefer that it comes from fee capture. But from the perspective of it flowing through the system, it doesn't matter like what balance of like inflows and outflows and how we can set like a policy that like adapts based on those parameters, while keeping long-term issuance kind of like predictable and relatively low, while also ensuring that like in the event that we don't have enough fee capture or people just keep holding honey and raising the value of honey so that when we do capture fees, we're capturing a much smaller proportion of the supply, that the issuance will kind of kick in to correct that. I'm starting to ramble here. That's my kind of current thinking, is that like the problem is that we're balancing the need to give people like some assurances and remove discretion from issuance, so that people feel like if they hold honey now, their value is not just going to be in. Like we always have honey flowing through the system, even if we don't have enough like fee capture, because if honey isn't flowing, then people will start to stagnate and stop contributing, and everything kind of breaks.
I'm muted. I'm screen sharing a screen. If can you guys see it?
Let me switch over on the other stream.
Yep, I can see it.
Okay, so this is pretty basic to start, but basically what we're saying is that there's a supply of honey, and actually maybe it would even be better I reshuffled these so that it's easier to draw piping between them. But there's sort of multiple things going on here, and I want to separate between the notion of honey coming into existence and honey sort of moving between subsystems. Some of the honey that's active in the sort of conviction voting DAO, that means that it's active in the sense that we call this the sort of effective or active supply for the conviction voting models, versus honey in honey swap or in the farms, versus honey that's held by the DAO in the common pool, versus this one, which is effectively other honey in circulation. Now, the vast majority of the time, honey is actually moving between these things, or even sort of, if I were to say unstake something and then stake something else, that's sort of a self loop on honey and conviction voting. I actually have some honey that I'm not doing anything with, but I'm not doing anything with it precisely because I intend to vote with it, and so I didn't put it in. Yeah.
Sorry, isn't honey in circulation a parent group of honey active in conviction voting and honey locked in honey farms and all of these things?
I am not using it that way. Variable we want to construct for these different things. So we could say that there's a definition, and maybe I can just say this is other if we want. This is other. This is the slack variable that adds up to the supply. And if we wanted to say circulation was, I'll color code them, right? So again, this is about defining variables. So if we wanted to, we could say that these yellow ones, they're just out there. They belong to not the DAO in a sense, right?
Yeah.
This is what belongs to the DAO. But what I'm also saying is that we other because we need this sum to add up. So the amount that's active honey in effect, basically effective supply from a voting perspective, that's one quantity. The sum of all of the liquidity in the liquidity pools is another quantity. The total in the common pool is a quantity. And what we're saying then is there's other honey that's not actually accountable for these contracts. Things. Does that make sense? It's a slack variable.
Yeah,
but that's
makes sense.
In a way, honey moves through that state in order to go to the other one. So you could actually think of it like this, such that if you get a reward to do a project, it actually goes into other because it just goes out to people, and they might trade it in order to get X die on a farm, at which point it would end up through that swap in the liquidity pool. They might add it as liquidity, which is a different mechanism that moves it here. They might also just choose to use it to vote for the next proposal. So in a sense, that the issuance by default actually creates supply that exists in the common pool. So again, I'm just kind of I normally use the fat bars, but they're a little harder to work with. We could imagine issuance really comes into existence through expanding the pool. And the it might go through, funding a proposal. It might go through, the funds that pay the faucet come from the common pool as well, right?
Yeah, but they all go through proposals. There's no other way to leave the common pool other than through conviction proposals.
Gotcha. So, but that means that the funding of proposals can create what is essentially, this is a little bit interesting, but there's a sort of notion of directly funding a proposal, which is, direct outflow. But there's this interesting thing that happens where you can kind of fund a proposal that creates a pipe, right? So like the faucet is an example of something where you sort of funded a proposal, but it created an ongoing process, right?
Yeah.
Or would you say it just funded a bucket of funds and then it disperses those funds until they're gone?
I think that the idea of these like being treated as pipes, the faucet and the farms. Also, a small nitpick here, just because I wasn't going to bring it up because I don't think it's that relevant, but I keep looking at it, so I'm going to. honey locked
Right.
in honey farms is very different than honey in liquidity pools on HoneySwap. The farms are like a reward, one of those pipelines essentially. And the honey
Yeah, that's
in
fair.
the automated market maker is different.
Gotcha. So I think that's fair. I was being a little bit cavalier because I'm trying to keep this simple, but let's just say honey in the automated market maker versus there's sort of an upstack thing, which is to say, well, actually, let me think about
It's
this.
one of those pipelines, just like the faucet,
Yeah,
right?
I see what you mean. So the honey is in the automated market. What you're actually doing is taking your liquidity provider tokens and putting them in the farm. So it's not really honey in the farm; it's honey in the AMMs. And then, given that you have LP tokens, you can then put them in the farm.
Yeah, though the farms do have honey in them as well, but those honeys come from proposals and are distributed in this kind of pipeline kind of
Those
way
are
to liquidity providers.
those are these like, so I almost think that I need a bucket for, maybe the simplest way to do it isn't specific to the farms, but let's call this honey locked in existing commitments. So like, I know this sounds weird, but what ends up happening is you pass a proposal that creates a pipe, and then it goes kind of like this, where you have, and again, I'm brainstorming here, but when I think about the honey with the farms, what you're actually saying is that there's a kind of policy that pays out of this honey locked in the farms, honey proposal made a rule that said the common pool is going to pay certain incentives, and so there's this like based on stuff that's going to happen in the future. Does
Yep.
that make sense? So for the moment, I'm going to call this funding a direct proposal, and I'm going to call this funding a, I'm going to just call it a policy proposal, because what you do when you do things like the faucet or the honey farm is you create this sort of flow that leads to this sort of intermediately locked. Still kind of belongs to the DAO, but it's committed to a particular program.
Cool. Can we have another inflow into the common pool that represents the honey swap fees?
Yes. And I would say these go here, right?
I don't know. I guess that's a question. Honey in the automated market maker is like a pool leaving the automated market maker and going to the common pool. What's happening is across all the fees, we're accumulating liquidity provider tokens in a contract. We're then buying honey off the market and then depositing it into the common pool. So it's like an external like contract from that, I guess, quantity variable that's just related to overall transaction fees on HoneySwap globally.
Yep.
And as those fees accumulate, it can convert into honey, buying them off the market and putting in a common pool.
Right. So I guess the challenge here is the granularity of the model. So what you're describing now is how I would go about starting to model HoneySwap, and that's actually one of the other priority items on the list. And the question again comes to scope of, all right, do we think that modeling HoneySwap becomes the priority just to understand how our market works, at which point diving in quite specifically, moving liquidity, swapping one way or the other, and how that generates fees, which in turn produce flows to the common pool, because the HoneySwap has wired into it this it has the element where the liquidity providers get benefits because we accumulate liquidity as volume throws through it, but we don't accumulate all of that liquidity. We like route some of it back to the common pool. And so that would, in my mind, be about extending or building a model specifically around how the HoneySwap AMM works, and in particular, that includes the the recognition of the mechanism and maybe even exploration of the policy associated with those fees. Like, how much are we really producing for the common pool versus producing for the liquidity providers? Again, that's, and in my mind, that's the scope of the model for HoneySwap.
Yeah, I totally agree that it's a separate thing, and it probably should be a priority. But I think that, like, on the issuance side, to the common pool, that like maybe proposals have like a positive impact on, or like we can make some assumptions about fee inflows, or like external exogenous buy pressure on honey from these fees that then get deposited into the common pool.
The reason I'm drawing it like this is because the way that I'm thinking about that HoneySwap model is that the fees are actually, like, the swapper is going to experience some fee. Then that fee would normally accumulate to the LPs, but some of it doesn't. It goes to the common pool instead. So it's a little bit of just an account choice, but like that's the reason why I'm drawing it from here. Not because it didn't come from Honey Other, but rather because under a normal Uniswap model, it's entirely captured by the LPs, but we're saying it's not all captured by the LPs. Some of it is being flown to the common pool.
Got it. Okay.
It's an interpretation, though. I grant you, it's not like, perfect representation.
Cool.
Okay, so if I have this drawing here, and this is sort of like roughly, a lot of these arrows are bidirectional. Maybe that's the first thing to do. This arrow is effectively bidirectional in that it represents, you could have people put in XDAI for honey or honey for XDAI. So in that sense, honey is moving both in and out here. Similarly, this is bidirectional because this is essentially staking to vote, right? So votes end, you unstake things or you just choose to stop supporting something. This is sort of, it flows both ways. So this gives us like a rough circulation of the honey economy, and my intuition is that issuance is trading off between the sort of the need to have a continued available pool. So if we're going to have lots of new commitments, so what I'll call policy proposals, then like you really need to make sure that you have a supply of funds to actually try out these various policies, and maybe they get removed in the future, or maybe they don't continue to get funded. But ultimately, we need to have a sufficient common pool that that's not viewed as unreasonable. And the conviction voting algorithm in particular has these conditions where it's much harder to pass something if you want a lot of the common pool. So what we want to avoid is a situation where the common pool is constantly draining, because that will make passing something always make passing the next thing harder. So one of the important roles of issuance is to make sure that we don't have this sort of zero-sum game where I don't want your proposal to pass because it's going to make my proposal harder to pass. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I guess the size of the common pool growing over balances out with funds leaving, like inflows and outflows need to balance, because otherwise conviction voting gets easier or harder, depending on whether you have a surplus or
we have to have this. Exactly. We have to have this idealized future state where common pool has sort of derivative zero. That doesn't mean it's not flowing things out and flowing things in, but we have this sort of idealized equilibrium where when you account for fees coming in, when you account for issuance coming in, and when you account for sort of both the funding policies and the direct proposals, that there's a sort of roughly net even flow. Otherwise, you're going to have sort of this, if it's expanding, then you're, or expanding too much, then you're going to get this perception of like honey losing value. And if it's contracting, you're going to get this issue with the decision making where, you'll stall out the, voting because people are like, I won't want to call it it's not a hard equilibrium. It's sort of like a dynamic equilibrium where the common pool, in theory, should be trying to stay mostly balanced, at least on average over time, to make sure that there's both a meaningful sense that we're not competing with each other directly. Like, obviously there's some competition in, like, pass things you want to pass and don't pass things you don't think should pass, but that you shouldn't have to block someone else because you want to do something. At the same time, we have to avoid, again, sort of saturating the economy and providing a sense that this is not worth having. And so that's a like kind of intrinsic trade-off that I think is entrenched in the question of the issuance policy. So with the 3 minutes we have left, basically what I'm saying is this diagram provides us a little bit of system framing, and that the real first work from my perspective is to sort of issuance policy do. And again, taking some of this conversation and rendering it in text, possibly rendering some of it in equations, and kind of taking us to the point where we actually have a design problem in front of us, and that we can sort of model and iterate on together.
I'm super excited to work on that.
So that's my proposal for action items, is that we try to turn maybe just this diagram into a statement of like a proposal where the deliverable is actually just a clear problem statement, and a problem statement angled at making this design problem an actual sort of, a policy design problem, rather than just a, hey, what should we do? I mean, it's always been, hey, what should we do? But kind of getting it concrete enough that a model could help us answer it.
Sounds great. I've got a hard stop, so I'm gonna hop off right now.
Me too, actually. So let's just say that we're going to start a Google Doc. Jeff will share it. Jeff or Jess will share it, and the goal is to write basically a 1-paragraph post, which is the proposal for this work. We're going to try to keep the scope tight so that it's only really the formal problem statement. That way it doesn't run on forever. We complete that, and then we define the next block of work afterwards.
Cool.
We'll work async about proposal amount and contributors.
Yeah.
I'll start to organize the contributors as well.
Sounds good.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. We'll drop the notes from this chat, and I managed to record the second half, which I think was the interesting stuff, so I'll drop that in the channel as well when it's ready.
Cool.
Cool.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.